Russia believed its Khmeimim Air Base and Tartus naval facility were untouchable strategic assets locked behind diplomatic guarantees and military might. However, on March 8, 2026, Turkish armored columns supported by F-16 fighter jets systematically severed every single supply route connecting these installations to the outside world. Within 72 hours, approximately 4,800 Russian military personnel found themselves completely isolated on Syrian soil, their Mediterranean lifeline transformed into a strategic prison. This was not a routine border skirmish or temporary posturing. This represented the systematic dismantling of Russia's entire Middle Eastern power projection capability, executed by a NATO member state with surgical precision. The maneuver signals the most dramatic realignment of regional power dynamics since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and Moscow's response options are narrowing by the hour. The images you are about to see on your screens will demonstrate how rapidly geopolitical certainties can collapse when strategic miscalculations meet determined opposition. What you see is not just military hardware and troop movements. The footage shows the death of Russia's Mediterranean ambition and the resurrection of Turkish regional dominance. In the aerial reconnaissance images that will appear on your screen shortly, you will witness Turkish armored divisions establishing checkpoints on every major road leading to Russia's naval port at Tartus. But that is not the most shocking detail. There are three decisive factors that enabled Turkey to achieve in 3 days what years of diplomatic pressure could not accomplish. We will examine each of these factors as we progress through this analysis. Now we must look at how this situation developed. On the night of March 7, 2026, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan convened an emergency National Security Council meeting in Ankara. According to reports from Turkish Defense Ministry sources, the meeting lasted only 47 minutes. By dawn on March 8, the 3rd Armored Brigade and 7th Mechanized Infantry Division were moving south toward the Syrian border. The operation carried the designation Yildirim Shield, meaning lightning shield. The timing was not coincidental. Russian forces in Ukraine had just suffered catastrophic losses during the Kharkiv counteroffensive, with Moscow losing operational control over approximately 300 square kilometers in just 11 days. The Kremlin's attention was laser-focused on preventing total collapse in Eastern Europe. Turkey recognized the narrow window of opportunity and moved with decisive speed. Within 18 hours of the initial troop movements, Turkish forces had established a security corridor extending 42 kilometers into Syrian territory, systematically cutting the M5 highway, the M4 highway, and the coastal road network that connects Russia's bases to both the Turkish border and the Lebanese frontier. The military operation itself demonstrates remarkable sophistication in joint arms coordination and electronic warfare application. Turkey deployed approximately 180 Leopard 2A4 main battle tanks and 85 domestically produced Altay tanks to establish armored blocking positions at critical road junctions. These positions were supported by Korkut self-propelled anti-aircraft systems and Hizara mobile air defense batteries, creating integrated air denial zones over the supply corridors. The Turkish Air Force maintained continuous combat air patrols using F-16C Block 50 fighters equipped with AIM-120C AMRAAM missiles and indigenous SOM cruise missiles. This air superiority umbrella prevented any Russian aerial resupply attempts while Turkish TB2 Bayraktar drones conducted persistent surveillance of Russian base perimeters. The drone coverage was particularly devastating. According to open-source intelligence analysis from the Institute for the Study of War, Turkish forces deployed over 40 TB2 platforms in coordinated shifts, maintaining 24-hour visual coverage of Russian troop movements. The drones were equipped with MAML smart munitions capable of precision strikes against any Russian convoy attempting to break through the blockade. The Russian garrison commanders quickly recognized they faced a technologically superior opponent with complete information dominance. Turkish electronic warfare systems, specifically the Coral radar electronic attack system, created a suppression bubble over Russian air defense installations. The S-400 batteries that Russia had previously deployed to protect Khmeimim Air Base found their targeting radars jammed by Turkish directed energy systems. This represented profound irony, as Russia had sold Turkey the S-400 system in 2019, creating a NATO alliance crisis. Now, Turkey was demonstrating that possessing Russian air defense meant understanding exactly how to neutralize it. The technical specifications reveal the thoroughness of Turkish planning. The Corral system operates across multiple frequency bands, creating adaptive jamming patterns that prevent radar lock acquisition. Russian operators reported their screens filled with false targets and corrupted tracking data, rendering the billion-dollar air defense network essentially useless. The immediate strategic consequence of Turkey's encirclement operation extends far beyond the tactical isolation of Russian military facilities. Russia's Mediterranean presence has served as the cornerstone of its Middle Eastern strategy since 2015, when Moscow intervened in the Syrian civil war. The Tartus naval facility represents Russia's only Mediterranean port with permanent basing rights, providing the Russian Navy's ability to project power across the entire eastern Mediterranean basin. The facility has hosted everything from Kilo-class submarines to the Admiral Kuznetsov aircraft carrier during its ill-fated 2016 deployment. Without reliable land access to Tartus, Russia cannot sustain naval operations beyond short-term emergency resupply via sea lanes that Turkey now effectively controls through its command of the Bosphorus Strait. The Khmeimim airbase situation is equally catastrophic for Russian operational planning. The facility has served as the primary staging ground for Russian air operations across Syria, Iraq, and Libya. According to German intelligence assessments released in February 2026, Khmeimim hosted between 40 and 60 combat aircraft at any given time, including Su-34 fighter bombers, Su-35S air superiority fighters, and Su-25 ground attack aircraft. These platforms conducted an average of 120 sorties per week, supporting Syrian government forces and Russian mercenary operations throughout the region. The Turkish encirclement has grounded this entire air component. Without fuel resupply, ammunition stocks and maintenance parts flowing through land corridors, the aircraft sit immobilized on their hard stands. Russian commanders face impossible mathematics. Aerial resupply could theoretically sustain the garrison, but Turkey's air defense network makes large transport aircraft flights suicidal. Maritime resupply through Tartus remains technically possible, but Turkish naval forces have established a monitoring cordon in international waters, creating diplomatic and practical complications for any Russian naval convoy. The Russian garrison burns through approximately 400,000 liters of fuel per day, maintaining base operations and vehicle readiness. At current consumption rates with zero resupply, the bases have perhaps 45 to 60 days of operational capability before critical systems begin shutting down. This timeline creates immense pressure on Moscow to negotiate from a position of unprecedented weakness. The geopolitical implications ripple outward in concentric circles of consequence that threaten to reshape the entire regional order. Turkey's bold move represents the most significant assertion of Ottoman successor state power projection since the Republic's founding in 1923. Erdogan has systematically positioned Turkey as the dominant regional actor, leveraging NATO membership, while simultaneously pursuing independent strategic objectives that frequently conflict with Western preferences. The Syria base encirclement demonstrates Turkey's willingness to directly challenge Russian interests despite Moscow's nuclear arsenal and permanent UN Security Council seat. This represents a calculated gamble that Russia, already overextended in Ukraine and facing internal economic pressures, cannot afford to escalate into direct military confrontation with a NATO member state. The historical parallels to 1853 are striking. In that year, Russia and the Ottoman Empire entered the Crimean War, drawing in Britain and France to prevent Russian expansion into Ottoman territory. Today's situation inverts the dynamic. Turkey, as the Ottoman successor state, now constrains Russian Mediterranean ambitions while European powers watch nervously from the sidelines. The European Union response has been notably muted. Germany, France, and Italy all maintain complex economic relationships with both Turkey and Russia. None wish to see the situation escalate into broader NATO-Russia confrontation. Yet none can afford to publicly condemn Turkey's actions without appearing to side with Moscow against a nominal ally. According to leaked diplomatic cables reported by Politico Europe, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz privately described the situation as potentially forcing Europe to choose sides in a conflict where no good options exist. The Middle Eastern regional actors are recalibrating with remarkable speed, Saudi Arabia, which had been cautiously normalizing relations with Syria's Assad regime, partly to balance Iranian influence, now sees Turkish dominance as the primary variable in Syrian political calculations. According to analysis from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Saudi diplomatic contacts with Ankara have intensified dramatically, with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman seeking Turkish guarantees regarding Saudi interests in Syria's reconstruction. Iran faces its own strategic nightmare. Tehran had relied on Russian air power and logistics support to sustain its proxy networks across Syria and Iraq. With Russian capabilities potentially eliminated from the Syrian theater, Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders must contemplate operating without their most capable military partner. Israel watches developments with mixed emotions. Russian presence in Syria has complicated Israeli air operations against Iranian weapons shipments, but it also provided a communication channel through which Russia could moderate Iranian and Hezbollah activities near Israeli borders. Turkish dominance introduces new uncertainties about how Ankara will manage Iranian presence and whether Turkey will permit Israeli airstrikes to continue. The psychological dimension of Turkey's encirclement reveals deeper currents of national ambition and historical grievance that Western analysis often overlooks. For many Turks, particularly those aligned with Erdogan's political vision, the Syria operation represents restoration of natural regional order disrupted by World War I and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 and subsequent Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 reduced Turkish territory and ended Ottoman control over Arab lands. This historical memory fuels contemporary Turkish interventions in Syria, Libya, and the Eastern Mediterranean. Turkish military officers interviewed by Radio Free Europe reporters described the operation in explicitly civilizational terms. One colonel stated, quote, "We are not invading Syria. We are restoring security to lands that require Turkish protection from external predators." End quote. This framing positions Turkey as regional protector rather than aggressor, a narrative carefully cultivated for both domestic and international consumption. For Russian soldiers trapped inside the encircled bases, the psychological pressure intensifies daily. These personnel deployed to Syria expecting comfortable Mediterranean posting far from the Ukrainian meat grinder. Instead, they find themselves potentially facing the same isolation and supply deprivation that has characterized the worst Russian positions in Ukraine. The social media accounts of base personnel, monitored by open-source intelligence analysts, reveal growing anxiety about their situation. One post translated from Russian described the mood as, quote, "We came here to escape Ukraine, but Ukraine has followed us," end quote. The comparison to Ukrainian encirclement operations is apt and deeply disturbing for Russian military morale. The Assad regime's reaction combines public defiance with private panic. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad owes his continued rule to Russian military intervention that began in 2015. Without Russian air support, Assad's forces cannot maintain control over Syrian territory against remaining rebel groups, Kurdish forces, and potential Turkish proxies. Yet Assad cannot publicly criticize Turkey's actions without acknowledging his complete dependence on foreign military support. Syrian state media has maintained near-total silence on the encirclement, an absence that speaks volumes about Damascus's paralysis. Syrian military units near the Russian bases have received no orders to challenge Turkish positions, confirming that Assad will not risk direct confrontation with Turkey to rescue his Russian patrons. This abandonment reveals the fundamental hollowness of the Assad-Putin partnership. When pressure arrives, Syria will prioritize regime survival over alliance loyalty, leaving Russia to face consequences alone. For Putin personally, the Syria humiliation arrives at the worst possible moment. The Russian president has staked his historical legacy on restoring Russian great power status through military intervention and strategic assertiveness. The Syrian intervention represented a signature achievement, demonstrating Russia's ability to project power globally and shape outcomes in strategically important regions. Now that accomplishment faces potential erasure at the hands of Turkey, a country Putin had cultivated as a wedge within NATO. The personal element cannot be ignored. Putin and Erdogan have maintained a complex relationship, combining cooperation and competition across multiple domains. They collaborate on energy projects like the Turk Stream natural gas pipeline, while competing for influence in the Caucasus, Central Asia, and Libya. The Syria-based blockade represents Erdogan's judgment that Putin's weakness in Ukraine creates opportunity to fundamentally shift the regional balance without facing unacceptable consequences. What happens next depends on calculations being made simultaneously in Moscow, Ankara, and Washington. Russia faces three basic options, none attractive. First, Moscow could attempt military escalation, using available naval and air assets to break the Turkish blockade through force. This option carries catastrophic risks. Any direct Russian military action against Turkish forces would trigger NATO Article 5 considerations, potentially drawing the United States and European allies into direct confrontation with Russia. Given Russia's already strained military posture in Ukraine, opening a second front against NATO would be strategic suicide. Kremlin military planners understand this math, which is precisely why Turkey felt confident executing the encirclement. Second, Russia could pursue diplomatic resolution through negotiated agreement with Turkey. This option requires accepting humiliating concessions to end the blockade. Turkey's price will be steep, likely including Russian acceptance of permanent Turkish security zones in northern Syria, restrictions on Russian base activities, and guarantees regarding Kurdish groups that Turkey views as threats. Such concessions would represent public defeat for Putin, acknowledging Russia's inability to protect its own military installations from a regional power. The domestic political cost in Moscow would be substantial, potentially encouraging Putin's critics within Russia's security establishment. Third, Russia could attempt to simply outlast the blockade through aerial and maritime resupply, gambling that Turkey will eventually back down under international pressure or NATO concerns about alliance cohesion. This option depends on sustaining base operations through expensive and vulnerable supply flights while hoping Turkish resolve weakens. Current analysis suggests this gamble would fail. Turkey appears prepared to maintain the encirclement indefinitely, and each passing day of successful blockade strengthens Ankara's negotiating position while degrading Russian capabilities. The timeline pressure works entirely in Turkey's favor. Spring 2026 is transitioning towards summer heat, which will intensify fuel and water consumption at the bases. By June or July, the Russian garrison may face genuine humanitarian crisis if resupply remains blocked. At that point, Moscow would face the unthinkable prospect of evacuation under Turkish terms, abandoning facilities that represent billions of dollars in infrastructure investment and a decade of strategic positioning. The broader Middle Eastern order is already adapting to the new reality. If Russia's Mediterranean presence collapses or becomes drastically constrained, a vacuum opens that regional powers will rush to fill. Turkey obviously positions itself as the primary beneficiary, but Saudi Arabia, UAE, and even Egypt will seek advantages from Russia's weakness. Iran faces the most complex calculation, as Russian partnership has been essential to Iranian regional strategy. Tehran may be forced toward greater accommodation with Turkey, potentially reshaping the Shia-Sunni dynamic that has defined Middle Eastern conflict for decades. The United States watches this drama with careful satisfaction. American strategists have long sought to reduce Russian influence in the Middle East without direct confrontation. Turkey's actions accomplish American objectives without requiring Washington to bear responsibility or risk escalation. The Biden administration has maintained public neutrality while privately signaling to Ankara that the United States will not interfere with Turkey's operation. This tacit approval represents a significant shift in American-Turkish relations, which have been strained over Turkey's S-400 purchase and Syrian policy differences. The military isolation of Russia's Syrian bases represents more than a tactical setback. It symbolizes the accelerating collapse of Russia's claim to great power status across multiple domains simultaneously. In Ukraine, Russian forces burn through irreplaceable Soviet-era equipment stocks while failing to achieve any strategic objectives. In Syria, Russian bases sit strangled by a regional power that Moscow cannot intimidate or coerce. In the economic sphere, sanctions and energy market shifts erode Russia's financial capacity to sustain global military commitments. The cumulative effect suggests Russia is entering a period of strategic contraction unprecedented since the Soviet Union's collapse. Putin set out to restore Russian imperial glory through military adventurism and geopolitical manipulation. Instead, he has achieved strategic overextension, that now invites challenges from previously subordinate actors like Turkey. The Syria base crisis may mark the moment when regional powers recognize that Russia's ability to punish opposition has evaporated, encouraging further erosion of Moscow's international position. We are witnessing the transformation of the Middle Eastern security architecture in real time. The Russian presence that stabilized the Assad regime and complicated American and Israeli operations may simply cease to exist as a relevant factor within months. What replaces it remains uncertain, but Turkish dominance appears increasingly inevitable unless dramatic reversals occur. The coming weeks will reveal whether Russia possesses any credible response to Turkey's fait accompli, or whether Moscow must accept humiliation and strategic defeat. Only time will tell if Russia can extract itself from this trap without paying Turkey's price. What are your thoughts on Turkey's calculated gamble against Russian interests in Syria? Do you believe Moscow will accept diplomatic defeat or risk dangerous escalation? Don't forget to share your perspectives in the comments section. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like our video to stay informed as this situation develops. Russia's Mediterranean dream is dying on the shores of Syria, strangled by Turkish ambition and enabled by Russian weakness in Ukraine. The bases Putin built to project power have become monuments to strategic miscalculation. When Moscow prioritized Ukrainian conquest over protecting existing commitments, it opened the door for Turkey to fundamentally reshape Middle Eastern power dynamics. The ring of fire that Putin created in Ukraine has now spread to Syria, and the flames are consuming Russia's regional influence one base at a time. Presented by TGN. Thank you for choosing us.